Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to you all. My name is Mike Scott Bowman. I'm an alumnus at SOAS, having done an MA in Palestine Studies. And I'm standing in for my wife this evening, Professor Alison Scott Bowman, who can't be with us. In a minute, I'm going to be handing over to Dr. Nate George, who will be in conversation with our guest speaker. Nate is a lecturer here at SOAS in the politics of the Middle East. He's a global political historian of the modern Arab world. Prior to joining SOAS, he was a fellow at Harvard and at Columbia's Center for Palestine Studies. Our guest speaker over here from the US is Helena Cobban, who I've known on and off since the 1960s. I hasten to add, we were only school kids then. Helena lived in Beirut in the late 1970s, and she wrote about the politics of Israel, Palestine, Lebanon for the Christian Science Monitor and for the Sunday Times. She's lived in the States since the early 80s and was the author of a seminal and still very highly regarded book on the PLO. She has interviewed many of their leaders, as she has more recently several Hamas leaders. She is the founder of Just World Books. She is the president of Just World Education, who have recently published, well, I need to wave around because you can see it, Understanding Hamas and Why It Matters. It's a summation of a series of seminars that she has chaired in the last year with her colleague and co-author, Rami Khoury. I really do recommend it. It's conversational style, it's very accessible account of Hamas, and I can't recommend it too highly. So please give a warm welcome to both Helena and Nate.
Thank you very much for coming out tonight, and thank you for coming, Helena. It's an honor to meet you and to talk to you about your illustrious work in the Middle East journalism and research over the last decades. So just starting out with a basic question, how did you get involved in this research about and covering the Middle East as a journalist and researcher? What brought you into it?
So I did start out as a journalist, and it's a kind of white privilege-y kind of thing that you get this idea that, oh, I want to be a foreign correspondent. But generally that was men, you know, like Evelyn Moore or any number of guys who would do it. There aren't that many women who, you know, are like adventurous enough, but I was pretty crazy and I thought, hey, I want to be a foreign correspondent. I went to Lebanon and started studying Arabic there. And then 9 months after I went there, the Civil War broke out, and the Civil War was just really excellent for my career. There are some, you know, careers that are served by war. People who replace broken windows, coffin makers, and journalists among them. Also, you know, investors in the military-industrial complex. So it was super for my career, and I started out at Reuters and very speedily started working for the Christian Science Monitor and the London Sunday Times, which was very synergistic because the London Sunday Times had huge expense budgets, but only the possibility of placing one article per week. Whereas the Christian Science Monitor, where I had the best editors, really the best editors, wanted a lot of copy, wanted a lot of, you know, very well-written stories, but had zero expense budget. So there we were. I could travel, you know, all around East Asia and do my reporting and get a lot of that stuff published. So I honestly had no role models as female correspondents there. There were some older women. Claire Hollingsworth comes to mind, who worked for, I want to say, the Daily Telegraph. But all the older women foreign correspondents whom I knew made a point of not having children because it actually turns out to be a career that you cannot both be a female parent and like do your work. So I married a Lebanese person and had 2 small children, and then I discovered that it's actually not doable. I was in Baghdad covering the start of the Iran-Iraq war in September of 1980, and my husband of the time was in Tehran covering the other side of the war. And the nanny, who was a wonderful nanny, was home with the kids in Beirut. And my friends at Reuters called me up and said, they've put snipers on the roof of your building. So that was the end of my career, my glorious career as a foreign correspondent. I mean, there was no way I could continue to do my traveling and my foreign correspondenting while my children were in jeopardy. So I kind of scooped them up and brought them here to London. And that was the end of my glorious career. So then I thought I have to write books, you know, sort of fallback position. And I had these scads of notebooks full of all the interviews that I'd done in Lebanon, many of which were with Palestinian leaders. And I ended up actually writing 2 books based on my notebooks with the help and encouragement of Albert Hourani and Roger Owen, who were both then at St. Anthony's. And they said, Helena, you've got to write books. So that's what I did. And the first book was my book on the PLO called The what the heck? Oh, whatever it was called. It's a rather famous book. But and publishing that one, which I did, so I wrote it while I was in the United States, while the Israelis were bombing the shit out of Beirut and all my friends. It was very, very stressful because my marriage had fallen apart. I was there as a single mother with 2 small children in a strange country, and the place where I'd been living was being bombed. And the topic that I was writing about was being demonized on a daily basis in the corporate media. So when the book came out, I got accused. The book is called The Palestinian Liberation Organization, People, Power, and Politics. So it's like a political study of the history of the PLO and primarily the factions that make it up, primarily Fatah. And I did a lot of interviewing during the research for the book, but I also was using the interviews that I'd done in Lebanon. And I pulled it together, and I had no idea of the kind of the tsunami of hate that would come down on me after the book was published, because in those days, the PLO was viewed as demonic, terroristic. You know, why would one want to learn about their politics, you know, and what makes them tick, and how they make decisions, and why they make the decisions that they do. The questions that a normal political scientist would ask, or a historian. Anyway,
Was it, I mean, this is amazing, great. You already answered several questions, but was it difficult finding a publisher for that? How did you experience these kind of attacks? Was it the book reviews? Was it something more personal? And were you let back into polite journalistic society after that point?
I had a lot of support from my colleagues in journalism, my former colleagues in journalism. It was published by Cambridge University Press, which was just launching their new series in current Middle East studies that Roger Owen was launching. So it was actually the first title in his series, which has gone on and on. And the book has sold so well that at one point Roger told me, you know, Helena, the revenues from your book is actually fueling the entire series, which is nice to hear. I didn't see that many of the royalties. For some reason, at one point, Cambridge just handed it over to the public domain, and I still need to go back and figure out how that happened. But
amazing. So what were you mentioned you interviewed many of the leaders. Who were some of your more compelling subjects in that book?
Oh, interesting question. I would say the person that I interviewed at greatest length and greatest depth was this older statesman in the Fatah leadership, Khaled al-Hassan Abu Said, who was a Palestinian when I was interviewing him. He was one of the founders of Fatah. And he had two brothers. Hani al-Hassan later worked with Arafat, and Bilal al-Hassan was a newspaper editor in Beirut, much more left-wing than Khaled. Khaled, by the time I met him, had been the chief executive of the Kuwait municipality for several years, and then he had all kinds of business interests, and he was very nicely set up there in Kuwait. And I went to Kuwait and actually did several days of sit-down interviewing with him there, because one of the things I realized was that Fatah was, Gaza has always been the incubator of the Palestinian national movement in modern times. But the Gaza Palestinians, and we can discuss why that is the case, the Gaza Palestinians were generally, by the time, like through the 50s and 60s, they were getting a solid education, including a technical education through UNRWA, and then getting jobs in the Gulf. So all those little former sheikhdoms and trucial states in the Gulf that got their independence from Britain in 1970 or thereabouts, they didn't have the manpower to erect state governments and, administrations and school systems and banking systems. It was nearly all Palestinians with a few Egyptians. So Abu Mazen, for example, used to run the customs department in Qatar. A lot of these people founded essentially the state administrations in those states down in the Gulf. So the idea that the Palestinians need to learn how to run things before they can be allowed to, run their own country is ridiculous.
That's, amazing social history here you've laid out. When you're describing how demonized the PLO was now in 1982, do you see, how have things changed up to October 7th, basically? Did you see a loosening or a change in Western public opinion when talking about the Palestinian cause up until the most recent period, which we'll get into next?
Well, of course, for that, in that regard, what happened in the late 80s and then 1993 was crucial. In 1988, George Shultz did an initial outreach to Fatah through Abu Yad that actually my husband and I were kind of involved in setting up the channel. Didn't last for long, but there had always been a relationship between the CIA and elements of Fatah. CIA has traditionally had relationships with all kinds of people, and including Fatah back in the day when Abu Hassan Salami, who was head of security for Fatah, also had a relationship with the CIA. You can read about that in David Ignatius's book, Agents of Influence.
Yeah, and Kai Bird's recent book of what's it? Can't remember.
Yeah.
The Good Spy.
Yeah.
For instance.
But with George Shultz, it was the first time the State Department had actually had a link with Fatah. And then that was built upon even more after the Oslo process, when Yitzhak Rabin kind of paved the way for that mind-boggling scene I was present at when they signed the Oslo Accords on in the garden of the White House, where you not only had Bill Clinton very buddy-buddy with Rabin and Yasser Arafat, but then afterwards you had all these members of Congress who just days before had been demonizing the PLO as terrorism incarnate, lining up to have their photos taken with Yasser Arafat. Now he had been given the seal of approval by Yitzhak Rabin. I mean, it was so craven. And then, of course, they managed to completely co-opt Arafat through the Oslo process, put him and Abu Mazen and a whole, cohort of Fatah people on the payroll, which is where they still are, those of them that are still alive. And we see them acting in the West Bank as subcontractors for the Israeli military, as the Israeli military tries to Gazify the West Bank. So that's Fatah, and it's a tragic story. There are fine elements in Fatah at the grassroots and in the prisons. Primarily Marwan Barghouti in prison, who is a leader of the Fatah faction in prison, and who should be released in the second phase of the current ceasefire agreement. So after, Oslo was 1993. It was the result of the First Intifada, which had broken out in December of 1987. And December of 1987 was when the Muslim Brotherhood's Palestine branch, which had been sort of politically quiescent in Palestine for a long time, although other Muslim Brotherhood branches had a deeper history of political engagement. But in Palestine, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin had kept his head down. He built a lot of mosques. Fascinatingly, when all the mosques that he built had two stories, one for the women to pray and one for the men to pray. That was, he and the people who became the founders of Hamas were always very supportive of women's full engagement in religious, educational, political, and public life. I think that's worth mentioning. So in December of 1987, the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood decided to enter the political arena, and they founded the Islamic resistance movement, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, Hamas.
So that's perfect. So we've the setup of the Oslo Accords and Fatah, the degeneration of that movement from national liberation to subcontractors for the occupation, as you described it. So what were the factors that led to the engagement of these formerly quietists, Islamist elements, and what line did they take that distinguished them from the other Palestinian factions in the national struggle?
It was the pressure of the occupation that led to the First Intifada and to the emergence of Fatah, of Hamas at exactly that same time. So what distinguished Hamas was that it has always been based on a deeply religious understanding of the need for national liberation. So Fatah did have some, Islamist people amongst its founders, but has an overtly secularist program. And then, of course, there are the leftist organizations that are much more secularist, like the Jabhat Sha'biyya, the Jabhat Demokratiyya, and all their offshoots. So the distinctive feature of Hamas was engagement in politics on the basis of religious understanding.
And there are a lot of stories, especially after October 7th, circulated about the relationship between the Israelis and Hamas. How much credence do you give to this factor that alleges that there was, for instance, that Hamas was given a freer hand, for instance, to organize than the secular nationalists at the time by the Israelis? Was this a major factor in your estimation of the emergence of Hamas?
Look, it was a fact and a factor. Hard to say whether it was major or not, because, I grew up in an era of much remaining British colonial control overseas, and this is, you know, your classic divide and rule. So back in the 1980s, before Hamas was founded, certainly the Israelis supported the strengthening of the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood as a counter to the leftists, who were very powerful and still have some power in Gaza at the time. You know, there were communists in Gaza, very powerful back in the 1980s. So for the Israeli colonial administrators, strengthening Hamas, you know, was a way to deal with that. But that's far from the whole of the story. And more recently, we've seen, like in the lead up to October 7th, Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders wanting to fend off the idea of meaningful negotiations with the PLO by building up Hamas as a kind of a counter to weaken the PLO, but the PLO also weakened itself. So, yeah, it's a factor. And then Qatar, of course, the sheikhs of Qatar are very favorable to the Muslim Brotherhood view, whether we're talking Palestine or Syria or elsewhere. And it's a strange phenomenon that Qatar has this, you know, very deep support for the Brotherhood and for Hamas. So they were able to fund a lot of much needed social projects in Gaza in the past 15 years, including, you know, several of the universities, primarily the Islamic University of Gaza.
Which has been destroyed now.
Well, all the universities have been destroyed. And, you know, the president of the Islamic University of Gaza and my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Rifat Al-Arir, whose book I published, he and his boss at the head of the university were both targeted for assassination. And the whole of the university was demolished systematically. So yeah, there was a degree of Qatari support for, let's say, general Islamist, but also, you know, Muslim Brotherhood-y, and I don't think that the Qataris actually supported the military wing of Hamas, but we need to talk also about the difference between the military and the political wings, and, you know, how decisions get made in an organization like that.
Maybe a good place to start as a precursor to that is the Oslo Accords itself and the distinction between the Palestinian Authority, which was dominated by Fatah, and Hamas. So what was Hamas's position from 1993 through the 90s up to the Second Intifada? How did they relate to this whole U.S.-managed peace process, settlement negotiation scheme, and why was that so distinctive for them?
So they opposed Oslo, as did, I have to say, most of the people inside the Palestinian occupied territories, even people in Fatah, and because they looked at the terms of Oslo and they said, Abu Ammar Arafat, sitting out there in Tunis, doesn't have a clue what some of these terms actually mean. You know, like Oslo allowed what were called bypass roads for the settlers. And all this was within the context of an interim, 5-year interim settlement arrangement that was due to have been completed in 1999, at which point there would be a final peace agreement and the Palestinians, this is under the terms of Oslo, would get their independence. So the people who lived in the occupied territory said, you know, it's crazy to allow the settlers to have bypass roads because you know they will build these major highways that safely allow the settlers to come and go wherever they want from their settlements to each other and into 1948 Israel. And this will not be temporary. And many other provisions, including the very interim nature of Oslo itself, because you didn't have a defined endpoint. Oslo stated only that there would be a final peace agreement within 5 years, but not what the content of that peace agreement would be. So there was a lot of opposition inside the occupied territories from leaders of that First Intifada, and Hamas was definitely at the forefront of that opposition. So Arafat came back with his cohort from Tunis, first of all in Gaza, then went to Ramallah, and they had 2 rounds of elections in the 90s, one for the president, and amazingly, Arafat won the presidential election. And these were elections only for people who were allowed by Israel to live in the occupied territories. These were not Palestinian-wide. You know, Palestinians living in diaspora were not allowed to vote. And the second round of elections from 1996 was for the parliament of the PA. And there were people inside Hamas who said, we would like to participate in these elections in 1996. I think Ismail Haniyeh was the main one. And so they have a collective leadership, the political bureau, roughly 18 people who form the political leadership of Hamas. And they discussed this and they decided not to take part in those 1996 elections, but they did decide to abstain from any acts of violent resistance in order to allow the elections to take place. That was significant, you know. They wanted to see if this could work and if they could work with Fatah on this.
Fatah's response was?
No, Fatah has never wanted to work with Hamas, and that's been a constant. And I'm talking about the Fatah leadership. At the grassroots, there's a lot of cooperation, but the leadership is completely, you know, bought and paid for by my tax dollars and perhaps also yours. Your tax pounds.
I'm an American citizen too,
Okay.
so unfortunately I'm guilty from many angles.
So then we had the parliament. Then we had Arafat dying in November of 2004. The election in 2005 of Abu Mazen as his replacement, and the next round of parliamentary elections in 2006, January 2006. And this time, the Hamas political leadership decided to take part, and that was a major decision because it was a big, let's say, kind of concession to the whole arrangement of Oslo, the whole formula. And they took part, and they won, which Condoleezza Rice had not been expecting, and nor had Ehud Olmert. They were apoplectic.
How did the Western world and Israel respond to this victory of the democracy in the Middle East?
Yeah. I mean, that was part of the rubric, wasn't it, after they invaded Iraq, that we will bring democracy to.
The new Middle East.
So, yeah. Well, like I said, they were apoplectic, and they decided to cooperate closely with the Israelis and with the Fatah leadership to organize a coup against Ismail Haniyeh, who by that time was the elected prime minister. And the coup was rebuffed Actually, it fell apart completely. I mean, I've seen stuff like this happen in Palestinian politics several times, that the popular will just rebuffed them from Gaza. And so you ended up with a situation of Haniyeh had wanted to have a national unity government. He did not want to be the prime minister, but he was the leader of the Hamas faction, which at the time was called Change and Reform. And that kind of summed up their main political program against the corruption of the PA and the Fatah leaders. He wanted to have a national unity government, and Fatah rebuffed him, so he ended up as the prime minister in Gaza, and then Abu Mazen has designated a succession of people to be prime minister in the West Bank, in Ramallah. So you've had, divide and rule, very nice for the Israelis, and you also had, from 2007 onwards, this very tight Israeli siege on Gaza. So, with periodic Israeli assaults, which they call mowing the lawn. It's such an obscene term.
It was all justified on the basis of Hamas ruling in Gaza and being terrorists beyond the pale of engagement, right? Why is the West and the US, the UK, Germany, France, and Israel, why are they so wedded to this discourse of terrorism and terrorists when dealing with political opponents?
Gosh, I may be the wrong person to ask. But, I do recall back in the 1950s when there were the Mau Mau in Kenya, So the Mau Mau were not Islamists in any way, but they were definitely, demonic. Everybody knew, because the mainstream media told us, that these people were demonic. They had to be endlessly repressed. And then suddenly one day, the British Empire decides, we can't carry on doing this, it's too expensive. So they haul down the Union Jack in the capital of Kenya.
Nairobi.
Thank you. And, and there's somebody who previously Kenyatta had been working with the Mau Mau, and he's the new president. So that, that was happening throughout my childhood in various portions of the British Empire. So after 2001, of course, you had, after 9/11, you had the demonization of any Islamic religious-based resistance movement as out-and-out terrorists. And that has lasted for 24 years. I mean, it's amazingly,
Handy way to delegitimize your opponent, I suppose, to consider them beyond the pale.
subhuman.
Subhuman.
Yeah.
Targets for, grass to be mowed in the terms of Israeli military occupation. So we've discussed the political origins of Hamas, its engagement with the Oslo system, the Palestinian Authority. How has but it's not only a political movement as well. It's a movement that also vocally endorses armed struggle against armed occupation. So how is the military side of Hamas factored into its reception in the Palestinian community and the world?
So Hamas military, which is called the Izzeddin al-Qassam Brigades, it has been active for a long time in both Gaza and the West Bank, and to a certain extent in Lebanon. Previously to a certain extent in Syria, but that got very confusing with the internal Syrian divisions. So armed struggle has always been a factor for Palestinian resistance and is quite legitimate under international law. Under international law, it is quite legitimate to resist both colonial domination and foreign military occupation using all means necessary within the bounds of international humanitarian law. So Hamas is not the only armed resistance movement in Gaza or in the West Bank. There are actually grassroots networks of pro-Fatah, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades. There are that work in coalition with Hamas, with Qassam brigades in both the West Bank and in Gaza. There are the Abu Ali Mustafa brigades from the PFLP. There are Zarai al-Quds from Palestinian Islamic Jihad. There are all kinds of grassroots armed resistance movements that work together in coalition. The Qassam brigades is by far the largest and most powerful in Gaza, as we have seen during the recent hostage release ceremonies, which were used by the Hamas political leadership to demonstrate their power and the strength of their alliances with these other movements, not just in one place in Gaza, not just in two places in Gaza, but up and down the entire strip, because they had these ceremonies in all the different main parts of the strip. So, that gives you a kind of a sense of both the power and the popular support for the armed resistance movement, which is much broader than just the Qassam brigades.
And moving to the present context, of course, the October 7th Operation Al-Aqsa flood attack led by Hamas has really changed the face of, Gaza, the Palestine as a whole, the region as a whole, launched a war where Israel's fighting on, 7 fronts or so, and we've seen more coordinated resistance than in the past in many places. Why did Hamas decide to launch that operation, that fateful day on October 7th? What was the road that led it there, and what were they hoping to achieve?
Well, that is a huge question, obviously. We do cover it some in the book. The short version is that there are a number of reasons that I think led them to it. This was a multi-year preparation. Yahya Sinwar didn't wake up on October 6th and say, gee, tomorrow I'm going to do something. If you look at the resilience of their underground structures and their manpower, organizing, and it clearly was probably at least 2 years in the making. So you have to look at what the situation was a couple of years earlier. A lot of people have said that it was something to do with the threat of the Abraham Accords that Biden had given lip service to, although he was never able to nail them down, and the idea that the Saudis and others might actually join, the Saudis crucially, might join this coalition with Israel that would completely sideline the Palestinians. Then there's the factor of the continuing plight of the prisoners. Then I think about 7,000 Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli jails who had been languishing, some of them for decades, and many of them for several years without ever having charge or trial. And the prisoners have always been central in Palestinian nationalist thinking. Central for Fatah, central for everybody, because you can't just like have the cream of your society locked up in horrible conditions forever without it having a broad social effect. So previously, of course, we'd had the Gilad Shalit affair, where Hamas had, was it Hamas? Whoever it was, I think it was Hamas, had actually seized the serving soldier Gilad Shalit and held him for, I forget the details, a couple of years.
Yeah, a few years.
Yeah, and then exchanged him for something like 1,200 Palestinian prisoners, which, you know, for Hamas was an amazing success. So one of the key goals, one could perhaps say the main goal on October 7th, was to seize military hostages, captives, from the Israeli military positions which surrounded Gaza in what the Israelis call the Gaza envelope, which was a fortified series of settlements, each of them with a very robust security presence. That the Israelis call it the Gaza envelope, but the purpose of it was to envelop Gaza, because they had actually pushed the boundary in the late 40s and early 50s even further toward the sea. So on October 7th, that was what the Hamas military units were doing. They managed to disable the security, the surveillance system, the highly automated surveillance system that the Israeli military had erected around Gaza. And then they went to the head of the Gaza brigade and they captured it very speedily with almost no resistance. And then they went to the head of the Israeli military's southern command, the whole southern command of the Israeli military. They captured that with almost no resistance. And they took the leading officers from those two headquarters and from a lot of the other security places, and they took them to Gaza. But meantime, of course, they had disabled the surveillance system. The hoi polloi of Gaza, just like, you know, you get out of your concentration camp. I mean, they just poured out of the concentration camp into this totally undefended space of southern Israel and looted, went back to grandma's farm, you know, just really had an amazingly unbelievable day that they had never thought they could have. And I think they gathered that the idea was to take Israeli prisoners. So I think it's almost certain that most of the civilian hostages were not taken by Hamas. And we can see that now. We can see, you know, as Hamas is releasing hostages, they have to do deals with the clans in Gaza who took, you know, some of the civilians, or with the small resistance factions who had taken some of the civilians. I haven't seen a single account of a Hamas unit that took civilians, but we know that they are holding a lot of military now, because most of the people who are still held are military, and not just, you know, the kind of the frontline female Israeli spotters who were released 3 weeks ago, but probably higher up military people. So that was what they were trying to do, with the idea that they could release prisoners. And what happened on the Israeli side, it was a national trauma. The collapse of their entire concept of deterrence. And I understand that. Not just the people who were killed, but the collapse of that concept of deterrence through overwhelming force, which you could say explains the unbridled ferocity of their counterattack. So recently, who was it? Musa Abu Marzouk a member of the Hamas political bureau, was quoted, I think last week, as saying, gee, if we'd known how ferocious the Israeli counterattack would have been, we might not have done it. And then the rest of the Hamas leadership immediately said, no, he was misquoted. But I think it may well represent a point of view that's there in the Hamas leadership now.
One final question before we open it up. How do you think that members of the international community, and by that I don't just mean the Western nations, but the international community, how should they relate to this movement, to Hamas? Is the Israeli-inspired policy of prescribing all contact and legitimacy working for the world, for humanity?
So that's a great question, Nate. Before I answer it, I'm just going to introduce the book.
Sure.
Because, I haven't had the chance to do that. So this book is the result, it's the first 60% of the book is the transcripts of these webinars that Rami Khoury and I had. And so they're very conversational because it's like the transcript of a conversation. And our intention in producing the book in the way that we did was to make it accessible to non-specialists. So I know a lot of you here are specialists, and Nate is a specialist and whatever, but I want the general discourse to be able to discuss Hamas in a rational way. I don't want this just to be an arcane thing that a few professors in some university and whatever can discuss. But in the political discourse, people need to be able to talk about it. So the second half of the book is a series of appendices that present a lot of basic documents about the history of the movement, excerpts from them, including the document that Hamas itself produced in January of 2024, explaining what they were doing on October the 7th, which I think it's important. You don't have to believe them or not believe them, but you have to know how they present it, and then you can discuss it. So that's the book. What was your question?
So the
international
question which I noticed
community.
was tied in, which was in the book a bit, is how which is tied to the motivations that you just explained about why you wanted to write this book. How should the international community deal with Hamas? Should it continue to prescribe it, not negotiate it with it? Has that policy worked of total demonization?
So I come back to the original way you framed the question, which is not just the West, because the fact is that the Hamas leaders have visited Beijing, they visited Moscow. Both those countries and other countries from the global south have been working very hard to try to forge a working agreement between the leaders of Hamas and Fatah, which is the key political challenge of the present era. And for example, last week, when the Arab leaders had a meeting in Cairo to come up with an alternative to Trump's truly obscene Mara Gaza, or they can't decide whether to call it Mara Gaza or Gaza Lago. So the Arab leaders came up with an alternative to this, and one of the key things, they've got like a plan for $53 billion worth of reconstruction. The problem is not the money, the problem is the governance, who governs. And they came up with a plan for a technocratic governance structure in Gaza that would be supported by both Hamas and Fatah. Hamas have come out in favor of this governance structure. It's what they've argued for since the elections of 2006, which is 18 years ago. Children have grown up and become adults in this period. and Fatah have always refused to work with Hamas. So I hope that the Arab plan will lead somewhere. It was endorsed a couple of days ago by the League of Arab States, if that means anything anymore. I'm not sure if it does. But so there's a lot of international support for this kind of a plan, and it's the white Western world as part of its kind of global white supremacist desperation to hang on to control that is resisting it.
Well, that is, I think, a great place for us to pause for a moment, and thank you for this wonderful historical overview that you provided, very detailed Palestinian and regional politics, world politics as they relate, and really we'd like to open the floor up to your questions for Helena about Hamas and the Middle East, her career, or anything you'd like. So we have one here, one here, one here. We'll take, how about we take three at a time? Is that, or do you want to take?
You handle it.
Take three at a time, and then, or since we have four right now, we'll take yours as well. So go ahead.
Yeah, one of the first.
It'd be great if you could introduce yourself to the room as well.
Okay, my name is Agatha, and thank you for the overview of the book. One of the first things you mentioned about Hamas is the religious understanding of the national liberation. Would you please expand a little bit on that and what that entails, as opposed to a more secular standpoint?
Okay, thank you. Lucia?
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Lucia, I'm a student here at SOAS. I was reading recently that Hamas has had direct conversation with the US for the first time in a long time. And the main narrative is around hostages, which I tend to be suspicious of it. I don't think the Trump administration cares that much that there is an Israeli-American hostages amongst them, and what is your take on that? What do you think? What does that mean for this very feeble kind of ceasefire? And yeah.
Okay, great. Tim?
Hello, my name is Taylor, student at SOAS. Thank you for the conversational talk. My question is, to what extent was October the 7th wanted by Netanyahu, the current Israeli government?
Great, and one final one in the back we had.
Yes, so a few quick questions. Sorry, I missed the first part, so forgive me if you address this, but it was very good, the parts that I did witness. Thank you for that. The quick questions are, firstly, in its own terms, has Hamas achieved any or all of its objectives in doing what it did on October 7th? And secondly, which is related to that, when its political wing is gaming what actions to take, surely they would have anticipated a ferocious response. And given that, should we not be having more discussions about the way in which, when you have asymmetrical relations of power, the weaker party has to imagine how it displays itself in that situation? I'm thinking of the likes of Sartre on Dirty Hands, in the amazing piece where he describes the debate between Hugo and Hodler, in which the response from Hugo is that all methods are not good. And Hodler says, "Oh, how pure you are, my boy. How afraid you are of soiling your hands. Look at me, my elbows are sinked in blood." But this is a real debate. And if Palestine is to be liberated, we have to anticipate how the power brokers in the geosphere are going to respond.
Great. Powerful set of questions. I'll leave it to you to choose how you would like to address it.
I guess I'll take them sequentially. Religious roots of the National Liberation Program. So, I think it starts for people in the Ikhwan tradition with building a righteous community, building and defending a righteous community, and that was how they were prior to launching Hamas. But the righteous community is, the vision of the righteous community is always there, even though they engage in politics or engage in, which politics is a dirty business, obviously, or engage in military action, which is also a dirty business. So the kind of the right action, I'm a Quaker, and I get this at one level, that you want to pursue right action, and for them it is absolutely religiously defined. For example, one thing, whenever I can, I watch John Elmer's sections on the Electronic Intifada live stream when he's, interpreting the videos made by the Qassam brigades or by the Sarai al-Quds there on the battlefield. And they always, for example, when they hit an Israeli tank or an Israeli target and there are wounded and perhaps killed, and the medevac helicopters come in, they do not target the medevac helicopters. That is like a religious taboo, which we could wish that the Israelis shared that, but they don't. So as a Quaker, I'm not going to ever participate in armed struggle, but I appreciate from their perspective the self-discipline that they apply to this. And I mean, their engagement in the elections, their engagement in popular committees, it's all done from a motivation that is religious. So they have different, within Hamas, they have differing views on several religious issues, and they discuss them. I mean, the question of female leadership is something that many of them, I'm honestly not familiar with the religious sources on this issue, but many of them believe that it's written in some kind of surah or some kind of hadith that you should never follow a female leader. But they have supported, women running in parliament and women as ministers. But there is a debate over this question of female leadership. So, that's kind of the wellspring of their engagement. That's the only way I can explain it. I'm sure somebody else could explain it a lot better. We had like 5 wonderful experts in the book, and whom we, had our conversations with for the webinar series, and you can go to their books, which we have a wonderful bibliography at the end, and read more about the details there. But that's my kind of understanding of it. So the question of the recent Hamas-Trump contacts, it's in US political terms, it's really stunning that this got released yesterday by this Israeli reporter who works for Axios, who had revealed that these contacts between Trump's special presidential envoy for hostages, Adam Bohl, who it turns out was a classmate of Jared Kushner's at the Wharton School, and actually did a lot of interesting things for Trump during his first administration, including the contacts that he had with the Afghans, which he conducted in Qatar. Adam Bowl is an interesting guy, and the fact that Trump had him out there doing that, it's not trivial, it's not nothing. And the fact that Adam Bowl has been working closely with Steve Witkoff, who was the guy who, to my absolute delight, on January the 10th, when the Israelis said, oh, you can't come over on Saturday to talk to Netanyahu because it's the Sabbath. He said, that's bullshit. You don't actually observe the Sabbath, and neither do I, so I'm coming anyway. You know, where Biden would have said, oh, I'm so sorry, you know, I didn't realize it was the Sabbath or whatever. So it's a kind of refreshingly realistic and hard-headed approach to the Israelis. Of course, there are so many other things going on, like the outrageous, you know, video that Trump retweeted last week, or the thing that he put on Truth Social this week about, you know, the people of Gaza got to accept this, otherwise we're going to kill them all or whatever. I mean, Trump loves to send out mixed signals. He says, he himself sends out the mixed signals. He tells different things to different people. He has different people assigned to do often contradictory things. He's a master of chaos. That's how he, you know, because then he is the only person who can pull the whole thing together. I have a friend who says he's like the Norse god of, Norse god Loki, I think his name is. Yeah, okay. That he sows chaos, and that's a good part of how he rules. But the other key way that he rules is his magnetic relationship with his MAGA base, you know, which the Democrats are absolutely incapable of replicating or challenging, because they don't know how to talk to I mean, you can call them the MAGA base, but, you know, it's low-income Americans in the heartland who are feeling, you know, a sense of dispossession, a sense of alienation from the elites. And he just, you know, he's just able to talk to them. So, and then, you know, to generate their votes and have them overcome any resistance that there might have been in Congress. So if he says that he wants to do a deal with Hamas, he can do it. I don't doubt. But we don't know nobody knows, and that's part of the game. You know, he wants us not to know. He wants us to be sitting here saying, what the heck is he doing? He wants us to be sitting here worrying about him. So it's not nothing, but it's absolutely unclear as of now. That's my take. Okay, was October the 7th wanted by Netanyahu? No, I don't think so. I mean, it's clear that since October 7th, he has done everything he can to exploit it to stay in power. Because how can one possibly impeach a wartime prime minister? And, you know, he has all this police investigation going on into his corruption right now, and he keeps saying, oh, no, we can only have the investigation for 2 hours on Tuesday because I have much more important military things to see to, you know, so he's obviously used it, but did he want it? No, I you know, because there's no way that, I just personally don't see that he could have wanted it. It's going to be, at the end of the day, a massive stain on his reputation, and it already is. Has Hamas achieved its objectives? It achieved a few of the objectives. The Abraham Accords are history. So that's an objective achieved. It released some prisoners, some Palestinian prisoners, including some long-term prisoners, but of course, thousands more have been taken and abused and tortured and raped in Israeli torture centers. So on the prisoners, it's probably a net loss, not a net gain. That's how I would say. Has it upset any plans there might have been for? I mean, well, it's definitely irreparably dented Abu Mazen and the PA. There is no way that Abu Mazen can recover from this politically, except through the lifeline that Hamas has been throwing out repeatedly to Fatah. Should the Hamas leaders have debated the ferocity of Israel's response? It's a great question. And, you know, as I mentioned at the end, Musa Abu Marzouk seemed to have been raising that. Like, you know, we had no idea that they would respond this ferociously. The way I describe this or explain it is that on 2 occasions, Hamas has been catastrophically successful in major ventures. The first time was 2006. You know, when they participated in the elections, maybe they did so with the idea that they would essentially, in electoral terms, sweep the floor. But nobody that I was talking to at the time thought that that would happen. And how it happened and why it happened is interesting, actually. It has a lot to do with their, the networks they have among women, and the fact that, as my friend Layla El-Haddad noted, their women's networks were very careful to reassure all the women they were in contact with that your husband will never know how you voted. Because a lot of the husbands were on the Fatah payroll. But it's okay, you know, your husband will never know how you voted, so you can go and mark your X for Hamas. And so actually a lot of the victory of Hamas in the 2006 elections was due to the women, which is interesting. But then they had this ferocious counter-response, which was the attempt at the coup, and then the siege. So I don't think they expected that. Maybe they are naive. In October of 2023, I mean, given that their plans, intricately laid plans to capture the Gaza Brigade headquarters of the IDF and the Southern Command headquarters of the IDF. I mean, they must, you would think, have known that if they succeeded in doing that, it would drive the Israeli political class batshit crazy, which it did. I mean, I think you have to say that the early and even later Israeli response to what happened on October the 7th has been unhinged because of what they saw as the collapse of their entire concept of deterrence. I don't know. Later we will be able to discuss this, perhaps with some of the surviving leaders of Hamas. I'm really sorry that Haniya, whom I have interviewed and for whom I had a lot of respect, won't be around, is not around to interview. And same with Yahya Sinwar, who, you know, clearly, if you look at the book that he wrote while he was in jail, he didn't lay out his plans in public, but he gave a broad explanation of why this is happening. I think Hamas has a chance of winning something of what they want in Palestine. I would be very reluctant to quantify this chance. I think what Hamas has achieved is they have actually considerably hastened the shift of global power from the white elites who have run it since for God knows how many centuries, to a much more broad-based and global majority-based balance of power at the global level. So, you know, I don't think that was necessarily their goal.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I see the Israeli-American white country response to October 7th as having revealed the hypocrisy and bankruptcy of white leadership of the world in a way that it has never been revealed before. I mean, the support that the Palestinians of Gaza and their resistance movement have attained throughout the entire non-white world is unprecedented and strong and lasting and amazing, and is changing the world. I mean, the books that I publish, over the years I've published a number of books by Gaza Palestinians, including my friend Rifat Al-Arir, and a couple by my friend Layla El-Haddad, who's also a Gaza Palestinian, who is the author of the Gaza Kitchen Cookbook. We sold the rights to the Gaza Kitchen Cookbook to a publishing company in Japan. I mean, if you imagine that Japanese people can even access the ingredients or have any of the kind of the cultural background for cooking Gaza Palestinian cuisine, no, it's an act of solidarity. And, you know, we see this with the mass demonstrations all around the world. And then we see these corrupt, totally complicit and hypocritical governments in the United States, this country, Germany in particular, that go out and preach about, you know, oh, poor Ukraine, we've got to uphold international law in Ukraine, and, you know, the rules-based international order, and all that nauseating shit that Biden was talking about, while he's totally supporting Israel's genocide in Gaza. So, you know, the world sees that.
But what's new about that? I mean, that's been going on since the beginning of time, hasn't it? I mean, the Vietnam War was all about that, wasn't it? Muhammad Ali's comments about the Vietnam War. I mean, we could go back to Hiroshima, where the Indian judge had said he refused to try the case because of that exact reason. I mean,
no, you're completely right, but, you know, the white world has been able to control the international system and the international discourse very successfully until now. I totally agree with you, you know, on the fact that the white world has ever been thus, but I think right now something new is happening. And the something new is also related to the rise of Chinese power and the rise of BRICS and moves toward de-dollarization. I mean, there is a lot going on underneath the surface of politics that I think is new and that has been stimulated greatly by the resistance that the Gaza Palestinians have displayed. Or maybe that's airy-fairy, yeah.
Another question.
Are you up for another question? question, or shall I think we?
You be the arbiter of everything.
How are we feeling? Ready? Any more questions? We have one here.
Just a quick one.
Okay, we do
We have
have lots
one,
of questions, so there's an appetite. So let's collect as many questions as we can, and then Helena can choose what she would like to answer. So we have
Yeah, mine's
one
more.
here. We gotta get some people we haven't heard from. Shireen. Oh, okay. Let's go from right to left. So we'll start with you.
Okay, my question is about this being an anti-imperialist struggle, and in that framing, I want to ask about the prescribing of Hamas, both political wing and military wing, and compare and contrast that to, say, for example, IRA and Sinn Féin, and what are your views about kind of discrediting the ability to negotiate with this organisation and kind of the possibilities for negotiations?
Let's just collect a bunch and then we can
Okay.
answer in groups hopefully.
Yeah, mine is more a question about some reflection about the out of proportion response of Israel attack on Gaza after the events of October the 7th. How is that oversight possible when there was already a long history of out of proportion attacks from Israel? How they didn't predict that would be the case? You know, when just in 2021 they had like a major siege in Gaza, and after before that, I mean, we know like the long decades history of counterattacks, but every time they do an action, then they have this like unhinged response from Israel. So my question is like how they did not see that coming, because for me it just doesn't. It's impossible that they didn't see that coming.
And then we have.
Can I comment real quick on that aspect?
Yes.
Like we're moralizing their actions based on the aftermath, and I think like in asking, do they not expect? It's obvious that everybody expected a really insane reaction. It is going beyond expectations, but I think they have like accounted for that. And I think it's really weird for us to like moralize it when we're not there, when we're not being subjected to occupation. And also, how do we think Palestine would be free without violence or without repercussions or, I don't know.
Excuse me, where do you see the moralization? Who's moralizing me? I'm just asking.
No, I'm just saying that.
Objective question. No one is trying to moralize. It's more
Okay,
like
maybe that's
it's an
not-
objective question. It's like, how is that possible? There is no moral judgment in here at all. In fact, I'm not even against. Anyway, let's not talk about my view on Hamas. But yeah. So
Thank you.
there's
We
no
got-
moral
do you have
judgment
another
there.
question?
I have a question. Could you speak a bit about like the geography and the isolation of different parts of like Palestine and how that affects like ideology and I guess like grassroots movements? Sorry, another question is how does Hamas envision like after there is no Israel?
Vision, okay. Tamara?
I guess that kind of builds on that in terms of...
Can you speak up?
Sorry, I guess that kind of builds on that in terms of which part of the delivery factor Palestinian community they're in, where occupied West Bank, Gaza, diaspora, or Palestinian citizens of Israel. There's been a lot of kind of statistical overviews on do Palestinians support Hamas, do Palestinians support Fatah still, and then the equating naturally by the Israeli government of Palestinians equals Hamas. And I'm not talking now in terms of whether or not when we see these surveys that come out in very short periods, that kind of judgment as to whether they're right or wrong. What I'm kind of curious more into is the fact that, as you said, in 2006, when they were elected, children who were born then, or babies that were born then, are now fully grown adults. And if we consider the population of Gaza is 2.1 million, half of which is children, and the proportion of people that would have actually voted in those elections that are still alive or have not been killed in like the current context, then how, when statistically it's so myopically reductive and futile, has that been allowed to just become common discourse? And if you could comment more on like the purpose and intention of that, perhaps within the Israeli public sphere, I'd be just quite curious to know.
I want to ask what the responses to October 7th in Israel and the international community tell us about the viability or non-viability of using violence as a means of affecting political change in the contemporary world.
And one final question.
Is it not just like really crucial in terms of ensuring that Hamas are fairly represented to draw a lot of attention to the diplomatic initiatives that Hamas engaged in between 2006 and 2023, including offering Israel a long-term ceasefire hudna immediately upon becoming elected in 2006, including the diplomatic initiatives of 2017 of rewriting their constitution, etc.
Thank you. Very important points. I think that's all the questions we can accommodate now, and I leave it to Helena to decide how you want to tackle that. The themes of negotiations, Hamas's vision for the future, popular support for Hamas and different fragmented zones, and violence. Does violence bring political change? Somebody's using a lot of violence in the world to change things. It might not only be Hamas, I might just say, but that's my
So yeah, all very important questions. So the first one was about like prescribing versus negotiating with that, like the model of Sinn Féin and the IRA. I mean, this idea of kind of differentiating between the political and military wings. Of course, Nelson Mandela, who's held up as this avatar of non-violent, wonderful, peaceful man and whatever, was imprisoned for 28 years because of his leadership of the Mkhonto Sizwe, the military wing of the ANC. And finally, for a lot of reasons, the apartheid government decided he, or rather the National Executive Committee of the ANC, was who you needed to negotiate with, and he was the person who was under their control on Robben's Island, and so they brought him in and negotiated with him, and you had, this thing, and of course, South Africa's democratization has not been a complete decolonization as we see today. And it was a notable, something that happened at that stage in Western colonial decline, let us say, because just a few years earlier, you had the Portuguese decolonization from the neighboring countries, Mozambique and Angola, where the Portuguese just left, like the French in Algeria, where there was no attempt to placate the settlers and let them stay. So I don't know how it will turn out in Palestine, whether there will be a complete evacuation of the settlers, apart from the as they called them in Algeria, the Pieds Rouges, the ones who choose to stay and be part of independent Algeria, or what kind of accommodations will need to be made. So this question of, you have a difference between the military wing and the political wing. It's happened in a lot of liberation movements, and Hamas also, when they ran for elections in 2006, created something called the, Reform and Change Party. I mean, but it was still all Hamas, just as the military, the Qassam brigades are Hamas. I mean, it's the Hamas political bureau that runs everything. Obviously, if you want to have a negotiated anything in Palestine, Hamas has to be a major part of those negotiations. And that brings us to the question of like, okay, so if Netanyahu and Trump are successful in eradicating Hamas in Gaza, which realistically means a near total genocide in Gaza. Genocide, of course, includes, is defined as the destruction of a population in whole or in part. So you could have a considerably greater genocide in Gaza than you have had. Would that solve the problem of Hamas? No. Because Hamas is also crucially very important and influential in the West Bank and in Jordan. And so in Jordan, we have this US completely dominated, funded, trained military suppression organization known as the Hashemite Kingdom. But you have, a majority of the Jordanian population are Palestinians, and nobody has ever done the kind of, survey research among the Jordanian population that is very widespread in the West Bank and Gaza. But if you did, I'm sure you'd find huge support for Hamas in Jordan and amongst the Palestinians in Lebanon, and amongst not just the Palestinians in Lebanon, but amongst the Lebanese in Lebanon. So Hamas, to some extent, as some people say, it's an idea as much as it's a jihad, it's as much as it's a thing, it's an idea. What form it will take, when this genocide ends, if this genocide ends, we don't know how it will end or when it will end. But I'm very confident that the idea of Hamas is going to survive and probably be much stronger in West Asia than what it is now. And this comes in contact with the concept of martyrdom. Martyrdom is an important aspect of this, as it was for the early Christians. Come on, this is not like some weird thing that nobody's ever heard of, that you glory to the martyrs. It's a thing, and we see that in Gaza day after day. So, I don't know, there has to be contact, there has to be diplomacy. That's why I describe our book as a radical plea for effective diplomacy. And I just hope we can make a dent. So question about how they didn't predict the Israeli response. I kind of agree that that's not our question to discuss. That's the question for maybe the Palestinians of Gaza when all this is over, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. Because they're under such stress, and how do you even start to question the value of all this suffering?
Sorry, maybe I have to explain myself better because
No.
Just to clarify, there is no moral judgment. My question wasn't about if it was right or wrong. It was more about.
Excuse me.
It was more about how is that. Anyway, the question is another argument.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I want to come over to the segmentation of the Palestinian people. Obviously, that's been a huge factor. And it's a very systematic thing that actually the British introduced it in the 1920s and 1930s in Palestine, where you kind of split, the French call it quadrillage, where you split up the colonized population into little chunks so that you can take on each chunk separately. And the US cavalry did it in the West as they, settler colonized the American interior. It's a very traditional thing. So what you have in Palestine, you have the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, who are, in a very precarious position. You have the Palestinians who are in Jerusalem, who have a very weird situation under international law. They're living in an occupied territory, but the Israelis don't consider it occupied, and neither does Donald Trump, for what that's worth. And then you have, the West Bank is entirely segmented precisely by those bypass roads, that cut it up, so that Tulkarem or Jenin or Hebron or Nablus, you can cut them up and then go in and devastate them, which is what the Israeli military have been doing, and the settlers. So the matter of segmentation is really serious, and of course in Gaza we saw it with the so-called Netzarim corridor, like a 7-kilometer wide zone, and to divide the north from the south. And that is a small achievement of Hamas in the negotiations, that they were able to embed in the negotiations the idea that the people of northern Gaza could and should go back to their homes in northern Gaza. Well, of course, they don't have homes, but they have home communities. And prior to that, Netanyahu had been adamant that nobody would be allowed to go back north of the Netzarim corridor. So, yes, segmentation is going to continue as long as there is colonial domination, which is why those of us who are citizens of white countries need to take our responsibility to end those colonial projects once and for all. I heard a question about responses to October 7th in the West and in Israel, which I find interesting, honestly, because I did live through vicariously Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982 when I was writing my first book. And at that point, after the revelations about the Sabra and Shatila massacres in mid-September of 1982, 1 million Jewish Israelis took to the streets of Israel in protest at what Israel and its allied Phalangist militias had done in Sabra and Shatila. And they brought down the Begin government, and they forced the creation of the Kahani Commission, which ruled that Ariel Sharon should never again be allowed to occupy any position of authority in Israel. That was a peace movement in Israel in 1982. I don't know if you've seen the achingly sad photos of the anti-war movement in Israel today. You get maybe 12 people, standing, looking really miserable. And then the mass demonstrations are all of the settlers who want to, be allowed to continue raping Israeli prisoners. That's where the masses are. So this tells us a lot about, I've written a lot over the decades about the decline of the Israeli peace movement. Peace movement in this country, I don't know enough about it, but what I do know is that in the United States, there was a solidarity movement for the people of Gaza, but the counterattacks under Biden and now under Trump have been ferocious. And it's hard to see because in the States, especially right now, people are feeling under attack for so many other things to do with Trump that it's taken a lot of steam out of the Palestinian solidarity movement, honestly, because there's so much else to protest. So we need you guys to step up or something, or just, for the world community to really intervene at the economic level. Back at the beginning of this current crisis, I was writing things saying, the global majority can do to American imperialism what Eisenhower did to British imperialism in 1956, which was when, you know, Eisenhower just pulled the plug off the pound sterling and said, you know, you guys got to get out of occupied Egypt, and they did, because American economic power was capable of forcing that. But sadly, the global majority's economic power is not quite at a strong enough position now to pull the rug out from dollarization. But you can see it's starting to happen, and God, I wish it would happen soon, and we could end this.
Thank you. I think that's a great place to end with some hope. Please join me in thanking Helena Cobban.
Thank you all for turning out, and buy
Books are
the
available
book.
on sale over here for
£15 or $20.
£15 or $20, and we have some refreshments still available as well.
So I think you need to pay by PayPal, and you do that to Helena, that's me, at justworldeducational